As It Was by Tuesday Love Sang Rampa. Read for you by BlueFriend in beautiful BC. Chapter 6. After what seemed endless days, and I actually had no idea how long it was, but after this indeterminate period, I suddenly heard harsh foreign voices, and I was lifted by arms and legs and swung in an arc and let go. I landed with a splash just at the edge of the water and opened bleary eyes to find that I had reached some unknown shore. Before me I saw two men pushing frantically on the boat, and then at the last moment jumping aboard, and then sleep, or coma, claimed me again. My sensations were rather peculiar, because I suddenly had the impression of swaying, and then a cessation of motion. Later, I was told, after 5 days I returned to the land of the living, and found myself in a spotlessly clean hovel, which was the home of a Buddhist priest. I had been expected, he told me haltingly, for our languages were similar and yet not the same, and we found difficulty in making ourselves understood. The priest was an old man, and he had had dreams, or he called them dreams anyway, that he had to stay and render assistance to a great one who would come from afar. He was near death through starvation and age. His brownish-yellow face looked almost transparent, he was so undernourished. But from somewhere food was obtained, and over several days my strength was built up. At last, when I was thinking that I must be making my way on through life's path, I awakened in the morning to find the old monk sitting beside me, cross-legged and dead. He was stone cold, so he must have died in the early part of the night. I called in some of the people from the hamlet in which the hovel was, and we dug a grave for him and gave him a decent burial, complete with Buddhist ceremonial. With that task done, I took what scant supply of food was left and set out on my way. Walking was awful. I must have been far weaker than I had imagined, because I found myself left sick and dizzy, but there was no turning back. I did not know what was happening. I did not know who was an enemy or who was a friend. Not that I had many friends in my life. So I pressed on. After what seemed to be endless miles, I came to a frontier crossing. Armed men were lounging about near a frontier station, and I recognized their uniforms from pictures I had seen. They were Russians. So now I could place my location. I was on the road to Vladivostok, one of the great Russian seaports of the Far East. At the sight of me, the frontier guards set great mastiffs loose, and they came snarling and slavering at me, but then, to the amazement of the guards, they jumped at me with affection, because they and I recognized each other as friends. Those dogs had never been talked to telepathically before, and I suppose they thought I was one of them. Anyway, they jumped all around me and welcomed me with wild yelps and barks of joy. The guards were most impressed. They thought I must have been one of them, and they took me into their guard room, where they gave me food. I told them that I had escaped from the Japanese, so, as they were at war with the Japanese as well, I automatically became on their side. Next day, I was offered a ride to Vladivostok so that I could look after the dogs that were being taken back to the city because they were too fierce for the guards. Gladly I accepted the offer, and the dogs and I rode in the back of a truck. After a rather bumpy ride, we arrived at Vladivostok. Again, I was on my own, but as I was turning away from the guard room in Vladivostok, a tremendous noise of screams and howls and snarling barks rent the air. Some of the dogs in the large compound had suddenly been afflicted with bloodlust, and they were attacking guards who were trying to control them. A captain came, and after hearing what his frontier men had told him, he ordered me to control the dogs. By good fortune, I managed to do just that, and by telepathy I got the dogs to understand that I was their friend, and they would have to behave themselves. I was kept in that camp for a month while the dogs were being retrained, and when the month was over, I was permitted to go on my way again. My task now was to satisfy that terrible urge I had of moving on. Moving on. For a few days I hung about in Vladivostok, wondering how to reach the main city, Moscow. At last I learned about the Trans-Siberian Railway, but one of the dangers here was that many escapees wanted to get to Moscow, and for quite a distance by the sidings there were pits in which guards lay in wait so they could see beneath the trains and shoot off anyone clinging underside to the rods. At last, one of the men from Vladivostok Border Patrol, with whom I had been for the last month, showed me how to circumvent the guards, and so it was that I went to Voroshilov, where there were no checks on the railway. I took food with me in a shoulder bag and lay in wait for a suitable train. Eventually, I managed to get aboard, and I lay beneath, between the wheels. Actually, I tied myself to the bottom side of the railroad car floor so that I was quite high enough above the axles and hidden by the grease boxes. The train started, and for about 6 miles I endured being held by ropes until I decided it was safe to climb aboard one of the railroad cars. It was very, very dark. The moon had not risen. With extreme effort, I managed to slide open one of the railroad car doors and painfully climb inside. Some 4 weeks after, the train came to Noginsk, a small place about 40 miles from Moscow. Here, I thought, was the best place to get off, so I waited until the train slowed for a bend, and then I dropped safely to the frozen ground. I walked on, and it was a disturbing sight indeed to see corpses beside the road, the corpses of people who had died from starvation. An elderly man, tottering in front of me, dropped to the ground. Instinctively I was about to stoop and see what I could do for him, when a whispered voice came. "Stop, comrade. If you bend over him, the police will think you're a looter, and they'll shoot you. Keep moving on." In time, I reached the center of Moscow and was gazing up at the Lenin monument when suddenly I was felled to the ground by, I found, a blow from a rifle butt. Soviet guards were standing over me, just kicking me and repeatedly kicking me to get me to rise to my feet. They questioned me, but they had such a big city accent that I was completely unable to follow what they were talking about. And at last, with 2 men guarding me, one on each side, and a third man with a huge revolver poking into my spine, I was marched off. We reached a dismal building, and I was just shoved into a small room. Here I was interrogated with considerable roughness, and I gathered that there was a spy scare in Moscow, and I was considered to be some sort of a spy trying to get into the Kremlin. After some hours of being kept standing in a small closet the size of a broom cupboard, a car arrived, and I was taken off to the Lubyanka prison. This is the worst prison in Russia. It's the prison of tortures, the prison of death, a prison where they have their own built-in crematorium, so that all the evidence of a mutilated body could be burned. At the entrance to Lubyanka, or in a small vestibule, I had to remove my shoes and go barefooted. The guards with me put thick woolen socks over their boots, and then I was marched in dead silence along a dim corridor, a corridor that seemed miles long. There was no sound. A strange hiss sounded, and the guards pushed me in the back with my face against the wall. Something was put over my head so that no light could be seen. I sensed rather than felt someone passing me, and after some minutes the cloth over my head was roughly jerked away, and I was pushed forward once more. After what seemed to be an impossible time, a door was opened in utter silence, and I was given a very violent push in the back. I stumbled forward and fell. There were 3 steps, but in the pitch darkness of the cell I could not see them, so I fell and knocked myself unconscious. Time passed with incredible slowness. At intervals there came screams ululating on the quivering air and dying off with a gurgle. Some time later, guards came to my cell. They gestured for me to go with them. I went to speak and was smashed across the cheeks, while another guard put a finger to his lips in the universal sign of no talk. I was led out along those endless corridors again, and eventually found myself in a brilliantly lit interrogation room. Here, relays of questioners asked me the same questions, time after time, and when I did not vary my story, 2 guards were given special instructions. I was given an abbreviated tour of the Lubyanka. I was taken along the corridors, and I was shown torture rooms with poor unfortunate wretches undergoing the tortures of the damned, both men and women. I saw such tortures, such bestial performances, that I would not dare repeat them, because, knowing Western people, I know that I would be disbelieved. I was shown into a stone room which had what appeared to be stalls. From a blank wall, stone stalls extended about 3 feet from the wall, and the guards showed me how a man or woman was pushed naked into a stall, with hands upon the wall in front. Then the prisoner would be shot through the back of the neck and would fall forward, and all the blood would run into a drain, and so no unnecessary mess was caused. The prisoners were naked because, according to Russian thought, there was no point in wasting clothing which could be used by the living. From that place I was hurried out along another corridor, and into a place which looked like a baking house. I soon saw that it was not a bakehouse, because bodies and pieces of bodies were being cremated. As I arrived, a very burned skeleton was being removed from a furnace, and was then dumped into a great grinder, which revolved and ground up the skeleton with a horrid crunching noise. The bone dust, I understood, was sent to farmers as fertilizer, as was the ashes. But there was no point in keeping on about all the tortures that I underwent. But it will suffice to say that at long last I was dragged before 3 high officials. They had papers in their hands which, they said, testified to the fact that I had helped influential people in Vladivostok, and another that I had helped his daughter escape from a Japanese prisoner of war camp. I was not to be killed, they told me, but would be sent to Strizh, a city in Poland. Troops were going there from Russia, and I would go with them as a prisoner, and then in Strizh I would be deported from Poland also. Eventually, after a lot more delay, because I was really too ill to be moved, and so had to be given time to recover, eventually I was handed over to a corporal who had 2 soldiers with him. I was marched through the streets of Moscow to the railroad station. The weather was freezing cold, bitterly cold, but no food was offered, although the 3 soldiers wandered off, one at a time, to get food. A big detachment of Russian soldiers came into the station, and a sergeant came across, saying that the orders had been changed, and I was going to Luau instead. I was loaded aboard the train, which went off with many a shudder and jolt, and at long last we arrived at the city of Kiev. Here I and some of the soldiers entered a troop carrier. To be accurate, 40 soldiers and I were crammed into one. And then the troop carrier raced off, but our driver was too fast and too inexperienced. He careened into a wall, and the troop carrier exploded in fire from the broken fuel tank. For quite a time I was unconscious. When I did recover consciousness again, I was being carried into a hospital. Here I was x-rayed, and it was found that I had 3 broken ribs. One broken end had perforated my left lung. My left arm was broken in 2 places, and my left leg was broken again at the knee and at the ankle. The broken end of a soldier's bayonet had penetrated my left shoulder, only just missing a vital place. I awakened from an operation to find a fat woman doctor smacking my face to bring me back to consciousness. I saw that I was in a ward with 40 or 50 other men. The pain I had was incredible. There was nothing to ease the pain, and for quite a time I hovered between life and death. On the 22nd day of my stay in the hospital, 2 policemen came to the ward, ripped the blanket off my bed, and bawled at me, "Hurry up! You're being deported. You should have left 3 weeks ago." I was taken to Luau and told that I would have to pay for my hospital treatment by working for a year repairing and rebuilding the roads of Poland. For a month I did that, sitting beside the road, breaking stones, and then, because my wounds were not properly healed, I collapsed, coughing blood, etc., etc., and was taken off to a hospital again. Here, the doctor told me that I would have to be moved out of the hospital as I was dying, and he would get into trouble if any more prisoners died that month because he had exceeded his quota. So it was that I was deported and once again became a wanderer. For the first of many times I was told that I had a little while to live, but like many times since, I did not die. Walking along a road, I saw a car in distress, with a very frightened man standing beside it. Well, I knew quite a lot about car and aircraft engines, so I stopped and found there was nothing much wrong with the car, nothing that I couldn't put right anyhow. So I managed to get it going, and he was so extremely grateful that he offered me a job. Now, that's not so strange as it may seem, because that car had passed me some time ago. We had been crossing a river bridge together, crossing just where the border guards were stationed. He had been stopped a long time, and I suppose he had been watching the pedestrians and wondering what they were doing, where they were going, anything to pass away idle moments. I got over the border in very quick time, about the only time in my life that I have. But he offered me a job, and I could see by his aura that he was a reasonably honest man, as honest as he could afford to be, in other words. He told me that he needed to have cars taken to different locations, so I took his offer, and it afforded me a truly wonderful opportunity of seeing Europe. He knew the location quite well, and he had contacts. He looked at my papers and shuddered at the sight of them, telling me that I couldn't possibly get anywhere except prison if I had papers marked deportee. So he left me by the roadside for a time, after which he came back for me and drove me to a place, I will not say where. I was fitted out with fresh papers, a forged passport, and all the necessary travel documents. So I drove for him. He seemed to be scared of driving, and it was fortunate for me that he was. I drove to Bratislava and on to Vienna. Vienna, I could see, had been a very wonderful city indeed, but now it was knocked about a lot because of the aftermath of war. We stayed there 2 or 3 days, and I looked around the city as much as I could, although it wasn't easy, because the people were inordinately suspicious of foreigners. Every so often a person would sidle up to a policeman, and there would be a whispered conversation, and then the policeman would make sure his gun was in order and he would approach me and demand, "Papers." It gave me a good chance to check that my papers were quite authentic, because there was never any query at all about them. From Vienna we went to Klagenfurt. There was only a slight delay here. I waited about 8 hours and got thoroughly frozen in the drizzling rain, which came teeming down. I also got quite hungry because there was rationing and I hadn't got the right sort of coupons. But hunger was a thing to which I was well accustomed, so I just put up with it. We drove through the night to Italy and made our way to Venice. Here, to my regret, I had to stay 10 days. Unhappy 10 days they were, too, because I am gifted or cursed with an absolutely exceptional sense of smell, and, as possibly everyone knows, the canals of Venice are open sewers. After all, how can you have closed-in sewers when the whole darn place is flooded? So it certainly was not a place to swim. The 10 days dragged. The place seemed to be full of Americans who were very full of money and drink. It was an everyday sight for Americans to flash an immense roll of money, which would have kept most of the Italians for a year. Many of the Americans, I was told, were deserters from the U.S. Army or Air Force who had quite big businesses in black market goods. From Venice we went on to Padua, a place rich in history and redolent of the past. I spent a week here. My employer seemed to have a great amount of business to do, and I was dazzled by the different girlfriends he picked up, as other people pick flowers by the roadside. No doubt it was because he had such a big bankroll. In Padua, my employer had a sudden change of plans, but he came to me one day and told me all about it, saying he had to fly back to Czechoslovakia. But there was an American, he said, who very much wanted to meet me, a man who knew all about me. So I was introduced to this man. He was a great beefy man with thick blubber lips and a girlfriend who did not seem to mind whether she was draped or undraped. The American was another man dealing in cars, trucks, and various other types of machinery. I drove a big truck for a time in Padua. My load was different official cars, some taken from high-ranking Nazis and others from fascist officials who had lost life and cars. These cars, well, I just could not understand what was happening to them, but they seemed to be exported to the USA, where they fetched fabulous prices. My new employer, the American, wanted me to take a special car to Switzerland and then take another car to Germany. But, as I explained, my papers were not good enough for that. He pooh-poohed my arguments and then said, "Gee, I've got the very thing for you. I know what we can do. 2 days ago a drunken American drove into a concrete abutment and he was splattered all over the place. My man got his papers before they were even touched by the blood which came out of him. Here are his papers." He turned and rifled through his big, bulging briefcase and fished out a bundle of papers. I jumped to instant alertness when I saw that they were the papers of a ship's second engineer. Everything was there: the passport, the Marine Union card, work permits, money, everything. The only thing wrong was the photograph. The American laughed as if he would never stop and said, "Photograph? Come on with me. We'll get that done right away." He bustled me out of the hotel room, and we went to some peculiar place which meandered down many stone steps. There were secret knocks on the door and a sort of password, and then we were admitted to a sleazy room with a gang of men lounging around there. I could see at a glance that they were counterfeiters, although I couldn't tell what sort of money they were forging. But that was nothing to do with me. The problem was explained to them, and my photograph was speedily taken. My signature was taken as well, and then we were ushered out of the place. The following evening there came a knock on the hotel door, and a man entered carrying my papers. I looked through them, and I really could believe that I had signed the things and filled in all the details with my own handwriting. They were so perfect. I thought to myself, well, now, I've got all the papers. I should be able to get aboard a ship somewhere, get a job as an engineer, and go off to the USA. That's where I have to be, the USA. So I'll do what this fellow wants, in the hopes that I can get to some big seaport. My new employer was delighted with my change of attitude, so the first thing he did was give me a large sum of money and introduce me to a Mercedes car. A very powerful car indeed, and I drove that car to Switzerland. I managed to get through customs and immigration, and there was no trouble at all. Then I changed the car at a special address and continued on to Germany, actually to Karlsruhe, where I was told that I had to go on to Ludwigshafen. I drove there, and to my surprise found my American employer there. He was delighted to see me, because he had a report from his contacts in Switzerland that the Mercedes had been delivered without a scratch on it. I stayed in Germany for some 3 months, a little more than 3 months, as a matter of fact. I drove different cars to different destinations, and frankly it simply did not make sense to me. I didn't know why I was driving these cars, but I had plenty of time to spare, so I made good use of it by getting a lot of books to study marine engines and the duties of a ship's engineer. I went to maritime museums and saw ship models and models of ships' engines, so at the end of 3 months I felt quite confident that I could turn my engineering knowledge to marine engineering as well. One day my boss drove me out to a deserted airport. We drew up in front of a disused aircraft hangar. Men rushed to open the doors, and inside there was a truly weird contraption, which seemed to be all yellow metal struts. The thing had 8 wheels, and at one end was a truly immense scoop. Perched at the other end was a little glassed-in house, the driving compartment. My employer said, "Can you take this thing to Verdun?" "I don't see why not," I replied. "It's got an engine and it's got wheels, so it should be drivable." One of the mechanics there showed me how to start it and how to use it, and I practiced driving up and down the disused aeroplane runways. An officious policeman rushed into the grounds and announced that the thing could only be used at night, and it would have to have a man at the rear end to watch out for coming traffic. So I practiced while a second man was found. Then, when I was satisfied that I knew how to make the machine move, and even more important, I knew how to make the thing stop, my lookout and I set off for Verdun. We could only drive by night because of German and French road regulations, and we could not exceed 20 miles an hour, so it was a slow journey indeed. I had time to watch the scenery. I saw the gutted countryside, the burned out wrecks of tanks and aircrafts and guns, and I saw the ruined houses, some with only one wall still remaining. War, I thought. What a strange thing it is that humans treat humans so. If people only obeyed our laws, there would be no wars. Our law, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. A law which would effectively prevent wars. But I saw some very pleasant scenery too. But I was not getting paid to admire the scenery. I was getting paid to get that clattering hunk of machinery safely to Verdun. At last we arrived at that city, and early in the morning, before there was much traffic, I drove it into an immense construction yard where we were expected. Here a very grim-looking Frenchman, who seemed to be more or less square, rushed out at me and said, "Now take this thing to Metz." I replied, "No, I've been paid to bring it here, and I am driving it no further." To my horrified amazement, he whipped out one of those awful knives which have a spring. You press a button and the blade slides out and locks in place, and he came at me with that knife. But I had been well trained. I wasn't going to be stabbed by a Frenchman. So I did a little karate throw, which sent him down on his back with one awful clatter, his knife spinning from his hand. For one awful moment he lay there dazed, and then, with a bellow of rage, he jumped to his feet so fast that his feet were moving before they touched the ground, and he dashed into a workshop and came out with a 3-foot bar of steel used for opening crates. He rushed at me and tried to bring the bar down across my shoulders. I dropped to my knees and grabbed one of his legs and twisted. I twisted a bit harder than I intended, because his leg broke with quite a snap at the knee. Well, I expected to get arrested by the police, at least. Instead, I was roundly cheered by the man's employees, and then a police car drove up, with the police looking very grim indeed. When they were told what had happened, they joined in the applause, and to my profound astonishment, they took me off for a good meal. After the meal, they found accommodation for me, and when I was in that accommodation, a man came along and told me that he had heard all about me and did I want another job. Of course I did. So he took me out to a cafe in which there were 2 elderly ladies obviously waiting for me. They were very, very old and very, very autocratic. They did a bit of the "my man" talk until I told them I wasn't their man. I didn't want anything to do with them, in fact. And then one of them laughed outright, and she really did admire a man with spirit, she said. They wanted me to drive them, in a very new car, to Paris. Well, I was all for that. I wanted to go to Paris, so I agreed to drive them to Paris, even though there was a stipulation that I must not exceed 35 miles an hour. That was no problem to me. I had just driven from Ludwigshafen at 20 miles an hour. I got the two old ladies safely to Paris, and they paid me very well for the trip, and gave me many compliments on my driving. Actually, they offered to take me in their service, because, they said, they liked a man with spirit to be their chauffeur, but that was not at all what I wanted. My task had not yet been accomplished, and I did not think much of driving old ladies about at 35 miles an hour, so I refused their offer and left them to try to find another job. People with whom I'd left the old lady's car suggested accommodation for me, and I made my way there, arriving just as an ambulance arrived. I stood outside waiting for the commotion to end, and I asked the man what it was all about. He told me that a man who had an important job taking furniture to Cannes had just fallen and broken his leg, and he was worried because he would lose his job if he could not go or find a substitute. As he was carried out on a stretcher, I pressed forward and told him that I could do his job for him. The ambulance men halted a moment while we talked. I told him I wanted to go to that city, and if he could fix it, he could get paid for the trip, and I would go just to get that transport. He looked overjoyed in spite of the pain in his leg, and said that he would send a message to me from his hospital, and with that he was loaded into the ambulance and driven away. I booked in at the lodging house, and later that night a friend of the furniture remover came and told me that the job was mine if I would go to Cannes and help unload the furniture and load a fresh lot. The man, he told me, had accepted my offer, that he would have the money and I would have the work. At the very next day, though, I had to be off again. We had to go to one of the big houses in Paris and load up this great Pantechnicon. The gardener of the estate and I loaded it because the driver was too lazy. He made excuse after excuse to leave. At last, the Pantechnicon was loaded and we departed. After we had gone about a mile or less, the driver stopped and said, "Here, you take on the driving. I want to get some sleep." We shifted positions, and I drove on through the night. In the morning we were at Cannes, and drove to the estate where the furniture and luggage had to be unloaded. Again, one of the house staff and I unloaded, because the driver said he had to go elsewhere on business. In the late afternoon, when all the work was done, the driver appeared and said, "And now we must go on and load a fresh lot." I got into the driving seat and drove on as far as the main railroad station. There I jumped out, taking all my possessions with me, and I said to the driver, "I've been working all the time. Now you do some for a change." And with that, I went into the station and got a ticket for Cherbourg. Arrived at that city, I wandered about a bit, and eventually took a room at the Seamen's Lodgings in the dock area. I made quite a point of meeting as many ship's engineers as I could, and making myself agreeable to them. So with a little prodding on my part, I received opportunities to see their engine rooms aboard their ships, and I received many, many hints and pointers which could not easily be obtained from textbooks. Day after day I went to shipping agents, showing my papers and trying to get a berth as second engineer on a ship going to the USA. I told them that I had come to Europe on vacation and had been robbed of my money, and now I had to work my way back. There were many expressions of sympathy, and at last a good old Scottish engineer told me that he would offer me a job as third engineer going that night to New York. I went aboard the ship with him and down the iron ladders to the engine room. There he asked me many questions about the operations of the engines and about the keeping of records and watches. Eventually he expressed himself as entirely satisfied and said, "Come on up to the master's quarters and you can sign the ship's articles." We did that, and the ship's master looked a grim sort of fellow. I didn't like him at all. He didn't like me either. But we signed the articles, and then the ship's first engineer told me, "Get your dunnage aboard. You take first duty. We sail tonight." And that was that. So, very probably, for the first time in history, a Lama of Tibet, and a medical Lama at that, posing as an American citizen, took a job aboard an American ship as a third engineer. For 8 hours I stood engine room watch. The second was off duty, and the first engineer had work to do connected with leaving port. So I had to go immediately on duty without any opportunity to have a meal or even to change into uniform. But 8 hours duty in port was a blessing to me. It enabled me to get accustomed to the place, to investigate the controls, and so, instead of being displeased and unhappy about it, as the chief expected me to be, really, I was well content. After the 8 hours was up, the chief engineer clattered down the steel ladder and formally relieved me of duty, telling me to go and have a good meal because, he said, I looked famished. "And be sure," he commanded me, "to tell the cook to bring down cocoa for me." It was not a happy ship by any means. The captain and the first officer thought they were commanding a first-class liner instead of a beat-up old tramp steamer. They insisted on uniform. They insisted on inspecting one's cabin, an unusual thing aboard a ship. No, it was not a happy ship indeed, but we thudded along across the Atlantic, rolling and swaying in the North Atlantic weather. At last we reached the lightship at the approach to New York Harbor. It was early morning, and the towers of Manhattan seemed to be agleam with reflected light. I had never seen anything like this before. Approaching from the sea, the towers stood up like something out of one's fevered imagination. We steamed on down the Hudson and under a great bridge. There I saw the world-famed Statue of Liberty, but to my astonishment, Liberty had her back to New York. She had her back to the USA. This shocked me. Surely, I thought, unless America was going to take all and sundry, then the Liberty should be in the the USA. We reached our berth after much shoving and towing by small tugs with a big M on the funnel. There was the roaring of motors. Great trucks arrived. The cranes started to work as a shore crew came aboard. The chief engineer came and begged me to sign on, offering me promotion to second engineer. But no, I told him, I'd had enough of that ship. Some of the deck officers had indeed been an unpleasant lot. We went to the shipping office and signed off, and the chief engineer gave me a wonderful reference, saying that I had shown great devotion to duty, that I was efficient in all branches of engine room work, and he made a special note that he invited me to sign on again with him at any time in any ship because, he wrote, I was a great shipmate. Feeling quite warmed by such a farewell from the chief engineer, and carrying my heavy cases, I went out of the docks. The din of traffic was terrible. There was shouting people and shouting policemen, and the whole place seemed to be absolutely mad. First, I went to a ship's hostel, or more accurately it should be described as a seaman's hostel. Here again there was no sign of hospitality, no sign of friendship. In fact, with quite average politeness, I thought. I thanked the person for handing me the key to a room, and he snarled back at me, "Don't thank me, I'm just doing my job, nothing more." 24 hours was the limit that one could stay in that hostel. 48 if one was going to join another ship. So the next day I picked up my cases again, went down in the elevator, paid off the surly reception clerk, and walked out into the streets. I walked along the street, being very circumspect because I was, frankly, quite terrified of the traffic. But then there was a terrific uproar, cars sounding their horns and a policeman blowing his whistle, and at that moment a great shape mounted the sidewalk, hit me, and knocked me down. I felt the breaking of bones. A car driven by a driver under the influence of drink had come down a one-way street, and as a last attempt to avoid hitting a delivery truck, had mounted the sidewalk and knocked me over. I awakened much later to find myself in a hospital. I had a broken left arm, 4 ribs broken, and both feet smashed. The police came and tried to find out as much as they could about the driver of the car, as if I had been his bosom friend. I asked them about my 2 cases, and they said quite cheerily, "Oh no, as soon as you were knocked down, before the police could even get to you, a guy slithered out of a doorway, grabbed your cases, and ran off with them. We didn't have time to look after him. We've got to get you off the sidewalk because you were obstructing the way." Life in the hospital was complicated. Because of the rib injuries, I contracted double pneumonia, and for 9 weeks I lingered in that hospital, making a very slow recovery indeed. The air of New York was not at all like that to which I was accustomed, and everyone kept all the windows closed and the heat turned on. I really thought I was going to die of suffocation. At last I made enough recovery to get out of bed. After 9 weeks in bed I was feeling dreadfully weak. Then some hospital official came along and wanted to know about payment. She said, "We found $260 in your wallet, and we shall have to take $250 of that for your stay here. We have to leave you $10 by law, but you'll have to pay the rest." She presented me with a bill for over $1,000. I was quite shocked and complained to another man who had come in after her, a man who appeared to be some senior official. He shrugged his shoulders and he said, "Oh, well, you'll have to sue the man who knocked you down. It's nothing to do with us." To me, that was the epitome of foolishness, because now, how could I trace the man when I hadn't seen him? As I said, I had more money in my cases, and the only reply was, "Well then, catch the man and get your cases back from him." Catch the man! After 9 weeks in the hospital, and after the police apparently had failed to make any worthwhile attempt to catch him, I was quite shocked, but I was to be shocked even more. The man, the senior official, produced a paper and said, "You're being released from the hospital now because you have no money for any further treatment. We can't afford to keep you foreigners here unless you pay, so sign here." I looked at him in shock. Here I was, the first day out of bed for 9 weeks. I had had broken bones, double pneumonia, and now I was being turned out of the hospital. There was no sympathy, no understanding, and instead I was literally, and I mean this quite literally, turned out of the hospital, and all I had was the suit of clothes I was wearing and a $10 bill. A man in the street to whom I explained my problem jerked a thumb in the direction of an employment agency, and so I went there and climbed up many stairs. At last I got a job with a very, very famous hotel indeed. A hotel so famous that almost anyone in the world will have heard of it. The job was washing dishes. The pay, $20 a week and 1 meal a day. And that 1 meal a day was not the good stuff that guests had. It was the bad stuff left by the guests, or which was not considered fit enough for the guests. On $20 a week, I could not afford a room, so I did not bother about such things. I made my home wherever I happened to be, trying to sleep in a doorway, trying to sleep beneath a bridge or under an arch, with every so often the prod of a policeman's nightstick in my ribs, and a snarling voice bidding me to get out of there and keep moving. At last, by a stroke of luck, I obtained a job with a radio station. I became a radio announcer, talking to the whole world on the short waves. For 6 months I did that, and during those 6 months I obtained from Shanghai papers and belongings which I had left with friends there. The papers included a passport issued by the British authorities at the British concession. But as I began to feel I was wasting my time as a radio announcer, I had a task to do, and all I was earning now was $110 a week, which was a great advance over $20 a week and 1 meal, but I decided to move on. I gave the radio station adequate time to obtain a suitable replacement for me, and when I had trained him for 2 weeks, I left. Fortunately, I saw an advertisement wanting people to drive cars, So I answered the advertisement and found that I could take a car and drive it all the way to Seattle. There is no point in recounting the journey now, but I drove safely to Seattle and got a bonus for careful driving and for turning in the car without a single scratch on it. And then I managed to go on to Canada. So ends the second book, The First Era. End of chapter 6.